Paranormal detectives have a hard time of it in these United States. Their profession is much more respected and respectable in Europe, where history goes back further than 5 years at a stretch. Growing up, the few active North American paranormal investigators I knew of were the Scooby Gang, the Ghostbusters, and a Brit created by another Brit to explain things to, but more often than not cryptically hint at things to, Swamp Thing. The 90s brought us that other Scooby Gang, Detective Nick Knight of the Toronto PD, and Scooby Gang alumnus Angel of LA's Angel Investigations. Those of us who read books, hopefully, also met Harry D'Amour, a New Yorker created by another Brit who moved to LA to break into movies, with some actual success there at the beginning. And if we read comic books, we also eventually met a demon whose true name could bring about the apocalypse. So his friends call him Red, his adoptive father calls him Son, and everyone else calls him Hellboy. Sometime in the early 90s, artist Mike Mignola drew the original sketch of Hellboy and then set it aside. As a work-for-hire dude in the 80s and 90s comic book industry, anything he might have done back then would have immediately become the property of either DC or Marvel. And we should all see how that goes by now. Creators' ownership of their creations was the hot-button issue of the day, thanks in part to Jack the King Kirby's drawn-out legal battles with Marvel over rights to his original work, Neil Adams and Jerry Robinson's just-as-long battle to get Superman's original creators some actual recognition, and everyone being able to look just 3 states to the north and see the Dragon's Horde that the Ninja Turtles creators had amassed for themselves in basically no time at all. So Hellboy didn't see the light of day until 1994, when Mignola hooked up with a little West Coast company started by a store owner and fittingly named Dark Horse Comics. At the time, big-name artist-writers like Frank Miller and John Byrne were setting up a new imprint specifically for creator-owned titles. Dark Horse Legends. This is what gave us Concrete, The Big Guy, and Rusty the Boy Robot, Happy Birthday Martha Washington, and the Sin City story Big Fat Kill. You know, the one with Dwight and Jackie Boy's severed head. Hellboy's outlived them all, thanks in part to his creator's dedication and the plasticity of his premise. When your protagonist is the point man, for an international organization of paranormal investigators and eliminators, who's been active since the waning days of World War II, you can go literally anywhere and tell stories from any time within the preceding 60 years, as well as marching forward into the future. So by 2004, Hellboy had fought everything from Nazis to frog monsters to Edgar Allan Poe's conquering worm, and stood ready to face his greatest challenge, the American movie-going public. Hellboy kicked off the big dumb summer movie season of that year, premiering months before the twin juggernauts of Spider-Man 2 and Harry Potter 3 absorbed everyone's attention. Directed by Guillermo del Toro, fresh off the success of Blade 2, which taught us all what comic book movies would look like in 10 years, whether we knew it or not. I was there, third row center at the Century Cedar Hills, helping this movie do what at the time counted as middling business. Today it would be labeled a flop 6 months in advance, just like its own remake was. But back then, there was no Twitter. Shit, YouTube was a year in our future still. And oh god, I'm actually getting nostalgic for the hell year that was 2004. Save me, mediocre comic book movie. Actually, that's not fair. It's not mediocre because this is still a Del Toro film, which means it's full of beautifully composed shots depicting intricate sets and arresting landscapes, full of occult symbols, steampunk clockwork, and Catholic iconography. The pepperoni, black olives, and cheese of paranormal investigator stories. It's also the second most straightforward movie Del Toro's ever made. The first being Blade 2, but even that takes place in a world ruled by the vampire Illuminati. There are no cockroaches that walk like men here, no fairy tale metaphors for life under fascism, and no giant robots that require you to have a psychic relationship with your co-pilot. There's also no monster sex, which is unfortunate. We'd have to wait another decade for that too. Hellboy was even well reviewed, which was still a novelty for comic book movies at the time. The worst pull quote on Wikipedia, where everyone went to get their pull quotes before Rotten Tomatoes destroyed all of our brains, comes from then USA Today, and now NPR critic Claudia Puig. Quote, "Its far-fetched plot leaves a bit to be desired, and there is plenty that flat out doesn't make sense." Unquote. And no disrespect, especially since Claudia Puig's now the head of the LA Film Critics Association, so I know for a fact she's got shooters, but if anything, this plot is too near-fetched? Easily summarized in a sentence. This film tells the story of Hellboy and his friends at the Bureau of Paranormal Research and Defense as they attempt to stop the resurrected Rasputin and his Nazi girlfriend Elsa from bringing about the apocalypse. There. Done. Easy. What's so far-fetched? The closest thing to a plot twist comes at the second act low point, when it's revealed that Rasputin's been manipulating Hellboy and his friends this whole time. That's because Hellboy's red right hand is actually a key, meant to unlock a door to an interdimensional prison and rain giant squid god monsters down upon us all. Puig went on to say in her review, quote, "Those unfamiliar with the comic book may leave the theater bedeviled and scratching their heads." Unquote. But honestly, those of us who were familiar with the comics were also slightly bedeviled. Har har. And had more than a few things to scratch our heads about. Like, why is the BPRD part of the FBI now instead of the military? And yet they still have military planes at their beck and call. Why does Abe Sapien need psychic powers? I mean, way to downplay the whole research part of paranormal research and defense. And did this film really need to create a whole new character just so dumbasses in the audience can watch a dumbass audience surrogate fumble his way through this universe? All they really wound up doing with him was scoot him right up to the edge of becoming the third part of a love triangle, and then being too chicken shit to commit. Do we really need a love triangle in our Hellboy movie, we wondered? And does Liz truly have to be his love interest? Especially since they're more like siblings than love interests in the comics, giving this whole relationship airs that most people would rather not think about, unless they're flying Lannister banners outside their house. It's the old Carl Denham maxim, as unerring as the tides. One goes out and sweats blood to make a swell picture, and then the critics and the exhibitors all say, if this picture had love interest, it would gross twice as much. Yeah, sure, blame critics. Notice nobody blames exhibitors anymore, because most exhibitors are faceless theater chains. Interchangeable as fast food franchises, and just as eager to gobble each other up. You hear that, AMC? Fuck you! That was my lucky theater, and you dumb shits bought it up and closed it down. Probably gonna turn it into one of those fake IMAX theaters, where it's really not an IMAX, they just made the screen more square and a little bit concave. Yeah, fucking rip-off artists. The real answer to all these questions here, as usual, comes down to the junk science of focus group testing and the false magic of audience demographic research. The false belief that a movie named Hellboy can't be a quote-unquote date movie unless Hellboy is in unrequited love with his pyrokinetic best friend and her truckload of Catholic guilt. Portrayed well, for the story they're telling at any rate, by Selma Blair. It's not her fault that the story they're telling doesn't do Liz any favors until the end. Much like the comic book it's based on, if we're being honest. And then she still gets kidnapped, like every single one of Batman's girlfriends that don't stab him in the ribs. But we should never forget what this thing is. And this is a Columbia picture made 2 years after they put out a Spider-Man movie that claimed to be all about a girl, but was really all about Spider-Man's lust for said girl. At least Peter and MJ spent the whole movie doing that will they or won't they dance. Hellboy and Liz get all of 2 scenes together, and then it's time for the climactic battle. The bulk of their relationship occurred during the opening credit montage, after the World War II set prologue, but before this story properly begins in the present. So the emotional heart of this picture feels empty and rote, like a corpse you just resurrected so you could ask for directions. And that's sad, but it's also sadly typical. As is the amount of screen time given to dumbass audience surrogate John Myers, a recent Quantico grad handpicked by Hellboy's father to be the next intermediary between the BPRD's freaks, their word, and the FBI brass. Played wonderfully by Jeffrey Tambor, shout out to him. Myers' role, as you'd expect from an audience surrogate, is to gawk wide-eyed at all the supernatural shit going on around him, and occasionally articulate the film's point. "My uncle," he says to Liz about halfway through, "used to say, we like people for their qualities, but we love them for their defects." Nice sentiment, Johnny boy. I guess that's his other role, the dispenser of nice sentiments. "What makes a man," he says at the end, "the choices he makes." You might say, duh, but remember how dumb people are, and how they seem to constantly need to have the most obvious bits of their worldviews reinforced by the media they consume. Are you being ironic? Dude, do I look like I even know anymore? I mean, shit. Let's face it, John's here to streamline the exposition. To have someone around who doesn't know shit that everyone else can explain shit to. Which is funny, because any amount of exposition is going to be too much for the crowd that rolls their eyes at exposition in general. Unless it's about why the protagonist is cheating on their spouse. You can have the most straightforward apocalypse plot in the multiverse, and there's still going to be people who roll their eyes and say, oh, this doesn't make any sense. It's also funny because in the vast majority of Hellboy stories that I've read, like, the exposition is almost inseparable from the rest of it. That's because Hellboy sits at an interesting borderline between gothic horror and detective fiction, meaning that he is very rarely the focal point of the stories that bear his name. The people he meets and the occult forces he investigates usually fill that role, with Hellboy being our point-of-view character, and thus our audience surrogate. This is serialized storytelling 101, as codified by its patron deity, Sir Arthur Conan Doyle. Check out the first Sherlock Holmes story sometime, A Study in Scarlet. Yes, it does dramatize Holmes and Watson's first meeting. And yes, the ending does effectively set up the next 40 years' worth of stories, much to Doyle's eventual chagrin. But the bulk of it is taken up by the antagonist's backstory. A lurid tale of murder, forced marriage, and more murder, set in Utah and written by somebody who'd obviously never been to Utah. Compare to this story, which is almost entirely about Hellboy. From his miraculous birth into our world, to the then present of 2004, when he learns the supposed reason for that birth from Rasputin. But thanks to the intervening 60 years, it turns out Rasputin's plan is doomed. Hellboy's already had more than enough time to find a reason for himself to be here. He is the sword in the hand of the BPRD's logo, and the shield that it resembles. A mostly thankless job, dealing with things that could, and do, shred agents that aren't nigh invulnerable. But on the rare occasions he is thanked, he's the guy who responds with a shrug and a taciturn, "It's my job." A flat statement of fact that is clearly, for him, a great source of pride. But because he was raised so well, he's too modest to indulge in that pride. He is the friend who's a comedic double act with Abe, the dutiful son who hides his smoking from a father he knows wouldn't approve, the disobedient son who chafes at being confined underground between ops and sneaks out to sneak beer into the psych hospital his would-be girlfriend has willingly checked herself into. Cheap pisswater beer, but still, it's the thought that counts. And acting on those thoughts. The choice to act on the thoughts you have about and for other people counts even more. What makes a man? fuck if I know, but that seems like the happiest option. On top of all that, he's played beautifully by Ron Perlman, in a rare chance for Perlman to play a character who's completely aligned with the good. In fact, he's so good he eclipses nearly everyone around him, with the exception of John Hurt, and Doug Jones, and David Hyde Pierce, who together portray Abe Sapien, though Pierce refused credit for portraying Abe's voice out of respect for Jones's portrayal of Abe's body. The rest of the cast are pretty universal meh in comparison, unfortunately. Not bad, but watching this again for the first time in years, I was surprised at how much of their performances I'd forgotten. Compared to the powerhouses in this cast, Rasputin is a total nothing villain, Ilsa's just here to be fascist eye candy, and the Nazi cyborg Cronin can't speak, having sacrificed the fascists' actual source of power, their voice box, in order to become a slave to the Romanovs' old court magician. Because that's where fascism gets you, kids. Above and around the mall is yet another apocalypse plot. And if the Gospel of Buffy Summers taught us anything, it's that there's always another apocalypse. But as long as people choose to fight it, our walking virus of a civilization might actually have a chance. Problem is, in the real world, fighting it takes time and money. The two things most people have the least of. So most people don't even bother. They retreat into the sheltering arms of fiction. So, if you want a nice, straightforward, self-contained gothic horror comic book movie, you could do a lot worse than Hellboy. And Hellboy could have done a lot worse than it did. Some of the action scenes could have used a bit more work, but Del Toro's never really been known for that. He's known for telling weird stories at a pace that, if you're into the weird, is tight enough to keep you from noticing their flaws until it's over. And there's an outside chance that, even if you do notice the flaws, this film, and annoying people like me constantly telling you how the books are better, will get you into Hellboy comics. Combined with home video sales, shit, this thing probably even made money, and has since gone on to become what we used to call a cult classic, which is only appropriate. I was going to disingenuously speculate on why this wasn't the breakout hit of 2004, but I think the answer's pretty obvious. This was an era of comic book movies dominated by Spider-Man and the X-Men. And gods know by now, people barely have room in their heads for one major comic book franchise, let alone two. Spider-Man survived and thrived, given how he's Marvel Comics' entire youth outreach program by now, hence his perpetual confinement to the purgatory of high school. And as for the X-Men, well, we'll deal with their slow-motion apocalypse next. Thanks for watching, everyone. If you like this video, hit the like button, and the subscribe button, and the stupid bell next to it. Whatever. If you want. And if you really liked this video, consider supporting the show on Patreon. Like Mr. Hootie Dean, Detective Steve, The After Movie Diner, and Stu G. Next time, like I said, it's the end of the world as we know it. And I'm probably not going to feel fine by the end, but maybe you will.